So thank you, Federico, and good morning to all of you. I'll give and put on the floor some basic points as a way of opening a discussion about the question, what's social about social robotics. I proposed you a paper to read that was published on one of the last issues of the Social Studies of Science, and whose title is What Makes a Robot Social? But before, I think we have to look at some basic idea, which is at the core of science and technology studies perspective regarding what is the social, which is a question in regard to which STS scholars depart from traditional sociology. So here are for you four basic sentences stating something about how the social is framed within an STS perspective. The first one is that the social, what we name the social, is something heterogeneous in character. What does it mean? It means that elements which make up the social are not ontologically defined as being of a specific nature. It is not an ontological statement, I state, but a methodological one. And it is a stance toward the way in which the social is represented in classical and traditional sociology. Maybe you know the Weberian definition of the what's social action, which is something which has to do with an exchange of meaning, which is a condition for meaningful action. It is reference to others' actions and their meaning, which is orienting actors' action and is defining what a social act is. And in general, this is a very sophisticated definition of what is social action as the elementary unit of what we call the social in sociological analysis. It is maybe one of the most sophisticated. But what is in this definition of the social is a kind of ontology of the elementary units of the social. There are social actions, and social actions are the result of human acting. An STS stance towards it is that this definition of the social is a way to put within our cognitive framework a cultural stance which is typical of what we can call modernist culture. Modernist culture is that kind of cultural framework within which human and non-humans are the opposite sides of a dichotomy. Nature and culture are the opposite sides of a dichotomy. STS perspective takes a stance against this kind of perspective as an ontological perspective and as a methodological one. The idea is that nature and culture, human and non-humans, or artifacts as they are called within STS perspective, nature and culture again, differences which are continually constructed and reconstructed in what is an heterogeneous assemblement of entities. And second point, entities which make these networks are themselves conceivable as networks. So, what in sociological theory is defined as action or agency may be conceived as the result of these networks' dynamics. Third point, these networks are both variable in their geometry, in their compositions, and the result of their dynamics and their dynamic itself are in principle unpredictable. What does it mean? It means that there is some kind of contingency and there is room for interventions, and agency is the result, as coming from an observer, is the result of an attribution of agency. Fourth point, these networks are dynamic, but they also attain stable arrangements at some time, relatively stable arrangements. And these stable arrangements may be themselves conceived as something to which we can attribute agency, so the point, the center of a network, a unit, a stable unit in some way, because as a stable social arrangement, it may be conceived as a sort of black box at some point, something that we can consider as a unitary element from which agencies can emerge. But at the same time, they are always a network, and so they can be destabilized, they can be deconstrued, and often the researcher's goal is exactly that, to try to deconstruct what is considered in common understanding a black box and a unitary element from which agency comes out. As we can see through a variety of examples in STS research and literature, networks which are relatively stabilized become to be conceived as black boxes, and black boxes that translates, and this is a key word, translation will be a key word, agency to the various and heterogeneous materials that make up the same network. How does the network translate? It translates by coordinating, by fronting for them, by representing them, by standing for them in what appears as a simple and coherent form when looked from an external point of view. So it's why what STS perspective represents as networks may be also seen as acting as if they were a single unit, which, and it is important, can analytically be distinguished from what we call its environment, which is distinguished from the network makeup, and considered as an object with its own and consistent identity. So, do you remember yesterday Professor Tamburrini was speaking about consistency as an important condition for the definition of what is to be considered as autonomous action. But this kind of consistency is always a contingent accomplishment in our perspective, which does not mean that it is not in some way being constructed as an object of analysis, as an object of studies, as an object. But we have always to remind that this is an accomplishment. So this is what STS scholars call the result of some kind of labor, which disappear from our analytical framework when we are considering that as a single, consistent identity. The methodological strategy that is distinguishing STS perspective from a classical sociological perspective include developing a discourse that recognizes the deep and mutual constitution of humans and artifacts without, and here I am citing Dirce Suchman, losing their particularities and symmetries, because we are saying we are in front of heterogeneous elements. We are not saying that we have some kind of homogeneous ontology. This is very important for a lot of points that were at stake in what was called yesterday, for example. So, as STS researchers, we are going to look into the space between what we call, with Latour, translations, mechanisms or practices, and purification practices or mechanisms. Well, what are translation mechanisms? We already introduced the term translation as an important concept in the making up of the actor network, what we call the actor network. And translation practices are practices through which agency is shifted between, for example, humans and artifacts, humans and machines, and purification. What's purification? They are practices through which boundaries are maintained as clear and distinct. So all those practices through which, in discourses, through which meaning is endowed towards what is happening, those distinctions, those dichotomies are continuously reproduced, but shifted. The point is that within those practices, translation and purification, there is power which has to be identified. There are asymmetries, and each kind of account about what is happening, what kinds of translations, what types of purifications, who is distinguished from who, may be reconstructed as lines within and through which power is flowing, or as frames through which overflows are not considered. And every account is never an account from nowhere, from what may be considered as a universal perspective, but is always the result of some kind of positioning, as we learned to say from feminist scholars in STS, as Haraway or Barad, and Suchman too, and which in some way may be proposing a kind of knowledge who is performative. So, knowing is also performing through knowledge a framing of the world, a construction of reality, which is a way through which research are somewhat called to play responsibility, stance. As Lucy Suchman said, well, 10 years ago, when the Silicon Valley, they used to say, the future arrives sooner here, that here was unmarked. It was as a here which was in some way the locus from which future was being made for everyone. And she said, that was a neocolonial geography which was construing sort of technoscope which had to be reconstructed. What's a technoscope? It's a sort of landscape through which future is imagined, culturally made legitimate, and then inhabited by different categories of inhabitants, which are defined as human, as artifacts, but are pretended to be constructed from an unmarked, she said, point of view, an unmarked area that research, STS research, has to mark some way, so to show in its locality, while it is presented as universal. What is interesting to consider 10 years after is that technoscopes are being always constructed and reconstructed, that what is called globalization seemed to present those kind of landscapes as unmarked, but we have different years from which they are constructed. And research may show, and it shows, how these different years are locally constituted, and how what is presented as innovation may actually be a way through which reproduction of conservative frames, conservative, meaningful frame is produced. An example is the way in which Japan is an example of a strictly reproduction of technoscope through which local culture, conservative frames, reproduction of borders and of closure from which strangers are taken outside and at the margins, is reproduced. The special way in which roboticists from Japan are continuously recurring to Japanese cultural frames and to Japanese traditions and to Japanese specific nature is a way of reproducing and legitimating a conservative framework through technological innovation. The social is not some kind of qualification which can be or not attributed to machines, robots, etc., with a yes or no answer. Machines and robots are part of our social environment. And the shift through which the question is formulated about the boundaries dividing humans and machines is the result of the previous separation within the network and purification of the distinction between humans and the artifacts in the network through which agency is distributed. So, as a result of the purification of the distinction, the question comes. How can we restore the interaction between human and machines? The question is the result of separating the network, which makes the agency of what we call a man and the agency of the gun. For example, in the United States debates about banning or not banning, and regulating or not regulating access to weapons, through the slogan, who kill is the man, it's not the gun. So the point is not to sell guns. The point is we have men who want to kill. But, as Latour said, a man with a gun is a different actor network from a man, and it is a different actor network from a gun. The gun in the shop is different from a man with a gun. We are a unit as an actor network with our iPhones, which is different from what we were when we had not smartphones. Our agency is distributed through what we call us and what we call our iPhone. When I have not my iPhone with me, I feel that something of what I am used to consider myself is as an actor network within which the iPhone is included. And it's the same thing as the man with the gun and the man and the gun. Having looked briefly at the problem of how agency is attributed, we can now go on to the idea that humans and artifacts are mutually constituted. And this is a premise of an extraordinary value as a corrective to the modernist view of humans and machines or artifacts as autonomous, the one from the other, as integral entities that must somehow be brought back together and made to interact, which is the idea in the perspective of human-machine relations. But mutuality, the idea of mutuality warrants a closer look, maybe, because mutualities, which is the mutual constitution of humans and artifacts, do not occur in single time and place, do not create fixed human artifacts relations. Rather, artifacts are produced through highly specialized labors of division, those labors we were speaking about. That, as Law says, involve continuous work across particular occasions and multiple sites of use. And this work of production and reproduction across time and space results in very different assemblages involving participants with different histories, relations of familiarity or strangeness, and the like. Here we come to the point. And it is the increasingly extensive distribution of technologies and the range of variations across user-machine pairings that render protocols, standards, instructions, and the like necessary to the successful production and the reliable reproduction of human artifact interaction. And these mutualities are not necessarily symmetries. That is, humans and artifacts do not appear to constitute each other in the same way. We need a rearticulation of asymmetry that somehow retains the recognition of hybrids, cyborgs, and quasi-objects made visible through technoscience studies, while simultaneously recovering certain positionings within the networks among human and artifacts and their consequences, because, as I said, power flows through them. So, in an article which were in the issue of social science studies I was referring to before, Claudia Castagneda and Lucy Suchman explore what they call the resonating figures of primate, child, and robot in contemporary technoscientific corporealization of the so-called almost human, or the primate as almost human, the child as growing toward his full humanity, and the robot as almost human and maybe superhuman. They take as their model organism Lucy, which is a robot, orangutan, which was projected by Steve Grand, a roboticist, to create what he considers a sort of artificial life form with a mind of its own, which is developing, which is not constituted by its designer from scratch, but which is, as the mind of a child and as the capabilities of a child, growing, learning, developing, as in the evolution, which from the primate comes on to the human. The primate, which was the baboon Lucy, and now the robot, which is the new Lucy. The trope they follow is that of the model organism, which is under discussion within science and technology studies and in what is called figurations and technoscopes. And as an ironic description for their own looking at Lucy as a project through which to illuminate configurations within robotics more widely. Primate and robot are forms of natural culture that help clarify how the categories of animal and machine are entangled in this kind of technoscope, while making explicit investments in their differences from one another and from the third category, which is that of the human. So, the primate, the child, the robot, and the human, which is the prototype. The robot becomes a model for studying the animal and its development and its capabilities, and at the same time for studying human cognition and its enhancement. But the question which, following Donna Haraway, they make us confronting with is what other possibilities there might be for figuring humans, robots, and their relations if we escape the reiterative imaginary of the robot as a proxy for becoming human and as a prospective future for superhumanism. Analyses that describe the active role of artifacts in the configuration of networks generally imply, or seem to imply, other actors standing just off stage, out of the frame, from whom technologies act as delegates, translators, mediators. That is, as yesterday we saw, human engineers, designers, but also users, etc. And the persistent presence of human designers, users in technoscientific discourse is more than a residue of modernism. It reflects a durable asymmetry in discourse among human and non-human actors. Humans are, in these representations, those actants that conceive and initiate technological projects and configure material semiotic networks. However, they are simultaneously and continuously interpolated into and through them. In a not so recent contribution, it is from 2008, Lucy Suchman, I think, posed some kind of interesting questions about this subject. And she proposed to keep in view, she says, the ways in which this kind of asymmetry matters when things travel across the human artifact boundary. When, she says, objects are subjectified, for example, machines made not actants but actors, and subjects objectified, for examples, practices made methods and knowledge, effects, emotions, thinking about so-called companion robots, made commodities. What is working when maintaining a distinction between phenomena and the knowledge practices that render those phenomena as particular social material objects. Applied to the question of agency, according to Schuckmann, we are witnessing, she says, a reiteration of traditional modernist notions of agency at the same time and even through the interactions of that notion with computational media. Far from recognizing the mutual interdependencies of human and artifacts, she says, contemporary discourses of machine agency simply shift the site of agency from people to their machine progeny. And this does not mean that human power is lost. And this is the point, that of power and of recognizing where it does flow. The assertion for autonomy for technology depends upon the obscuring of human labor and authorship. It is precisely in the obscuring of this labor, those of the engineers, those of the users, those of the designers, that the power of the technologist is renewed. The engineer we saw yesterday, wondering about ethical decisions, for example. And the point of view from which the idea of safe technologies is defined, which is a point of view, a perspective from which we are always on the side of those deciding or delegating decisions about who other may be killed and injured, and never at the other side. In what kind of actor network are we putting ourselves? Looking as if we were in a not marked here. And so we can keep our eye on the ways in which autonomous machine agency, however subserviently constructed, might be consistent with regulatory practices aimed at producing certain kind of humans, for example, the enemies, the Talibans. Or the terrorists who are out of that actor network, who have not the power to be in the agential network through which machines are made injuring, and that only their body, which becomes a weapon. So, as a way of recovering difference within the network without separation, Schuckmann reminds us of some feminist theorists, as for example Karen Barad, who are speaking of what they call agential realism, which is a position that takes reality to be sedimented out of the process of making the world intelligible through certain practices and not others. So if we are responsible for the actor networks within which our agency is realized. And if our knowledge is performative knowledge and in some way we are responsible for what exists as account of reality, what is the reality that current material discursive practices regarding, for example, computational artifacts or robots make intelligible, and what is excluded? And to answer this question, Brad and Haraway too argue that we need a simultaneous account of the interactions of humans and non-humans and of their asymmetries and differences. And this requires remembering that boundaries between humans and machines are not naturally given, but constructed in particular historical ways and with particular historical consequences. So, in some way, boundaries are not enemies, they are necessary for making meanings, but this does not make them innocent. Boundaries have real material consequences, cuts are agentially positioned, and accountability is mandatory. And so we have to find not less false boundaries for all space-time, but reliable, accountable, located, temporary boundaries, which we should anticipate will quickly close in against us. So the point is that of refiguring the point of view from which technoscapes are construed. The idea is not having one unique model for the kind of networks we are projecting. Not having human as the only possible model for robots, that is not pretending that only one kind of agent, one kind of actant may be the way through which we are not reproducing the divide between human and non-human through the projection of human into machine, but the way in which we are in some way prospecting a different way to make agency more sustainable, make networks more flexible, make asymmetries more transparent, and going on opening all the black boxes within which the evolution of technoscience may be concealing the reproduction of power balances.